So hi everyone, this is Erica Jane Patenyo, and for today's video, I'm going to report about chapter 17.3. So first, what is an emerging consensus macroeconomic for the 21st century? So the last 2 decades of the 21st century brought progress in macroeconomic policy and macroeconomic theory. The outlines of broad consensus in macroeconomic theory began to take shape in 1980s. So, this consensus has grown out of the three bodies of macroeconomic thought that in turn grow out of the experience of 20th century. So, Keynesian economics, monetarism, and new classical economics all developed from economists' attempt to understand macroeconomic change. So we shall see how the three schools of macroeconomics thought have contributed to the development of a new school of macroeconomic thought, and the New Keynesian school. A New Keynesian economic is a body of macroeconomic thought that stresses the stickiness of prices and the need of activist stabilization policies through the manipulation of aggregate demand to keep the economy operating close to its potential output. It interprets monetarism ideas about the importance of monetary policy and the new classical ideas about the importance of aggregate supply, both in long and in short run. So another new element, New Keynesian economic thought is a greater use to macroeconomic analysis to explain macroeconomic phenomena, particularly the analysis of price and wage stickiness. So we saw in chapter that introduced the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. For example, the stickiness, prices, and wage may be response to the preference of consumers and firms. That ideas emerged from research by School of Keynesian economics. Neo-Keynesian ideas guide macroeconomic policy. They are the basis for the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply with which we have been working. To use how the New Keynesian school has come to dominate macroeconomic policy, we shall review the major macroeconomic events and policies of the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s. The 1980s and beyond, advice in macroeconomic policies. The exercise of monetary and fiscal policy has changed dramatically in the last few decades. Now let's proceed to the revolution in monetary policy. In figure 32.12, the Fed fights against inflation. By 1979, exploratory fiscal and monetary policies had brought the economy to its potential output. The war between Iran and Iraq caused oil price to increase, shifting the run short aggregate supply curve to the left. In the second half of 1979, the Fed launched aggressive contractionary policy aimed at reducing inflation. The Fed's action shifting and aggregate demand curve to the left. The result of 1980 was reasons with continuation of inflation. So, President Ronald Reagan, whose 1980s election victory was aided by reasons that year introduced a tax cut combined with increased defense spending 1981. While this exploratory fiscal policy was virtually identical to the policy President Kennedy had introduced 20 years earlier, President Reagan rejected Keynesian economic embracing supplies. President Reagan rejected Keynesian economics embarrassing supplies side arguments instead. He argued that the cut in tax rates, particularly in high marginal rates, would encourage work effort. He reintroduced the investment of tax credit, which stimulate investment. With people working hard, firms and investing more, he expected long-run aggregate supply to increase more rapidly. His policies, he said, would stimulate economic growth. The tax cut increased defense spending, increased the federal deficits, increased spending for welfare programs and employment compensation, both which were introduced by plunge in real GDP in the early 1980s. Contribute the deficits as well. As deficits continued to rise, they began to dominate discussions of fiscal policies. In 1990, with the economy slipping into recessions, President George H. W. Bush agreed to the tax increase to dissipate an early promise not to do so. President Bill Clinton, whose 1992 election result was largely from results of 1990 and 1991, introduced another tax increase in 1994. With the economy still in the recent gap, both tax increases were designed to curb the rising deficits. Congress in the first year of the 1990s rejected the idea of using explanatory fiscal policy to close the rational gap on ground it would increase the deficits. President Clinton, for example, introduced a stimulation package of increased government investment and tax cut designed to stimulate private investment in 1993. A Democratic Progress rejected the proposal. The defeat acted like straitjacket of the fiscal policy. The Bush and Clinton tax increases coupled with spending restraint and increased revenues from economic growth brought an end to defeats in 1998. Initially, it was expected the budget surplus continue well into the new century, but this picture changed rapidly. President George Bush campaigned on a platform of large tax cuts, arguing the less government intervention in the economic would be good for the long-term economic growth. His administration saw an enactment of two major pieces of tax legislation in 2001 and 2002, coupled with increase in government spending in part of defense but also domestic purpose, include the Medicare prescription drug benefit. The government budget surplus gave way to budget deficits to deal with times of economic weakness. During President Bush administration, temporary tax cuts were engaged in both 2001 and again in 2008. As the economy continued to weaken in 2008, there seemed to be resurgence in interest in using the statutory increase in government spending as discussion in case in point to the response of recession. Three factors from amount. One, the temporary tax cut and had provided only a minor amount of stimulations to economy as sizable portions has been used for saving another spending. Two, explanatory monetary policy while using had not seems achieved. And three, the recent strengthening the gold economy seems to be larger than those in recent economic history. The rise of New Keynesian economics. The New Keynesian economics emerged in the last 3 decades as the dominant school of macroeconomic thought of two reasons. First, it successfully incorporated important monetarism, a new classical idea, into Keynesian economics. Second, developed in 1980s and 1990s, shook economics confidence in the ability of monetarism of the new classical school alone to explain macroeconomic change. Monetary change in monetarism. Look again at figure 32.8 M2 and nominal GDP, 1960 and 1980. The close relationship between M2 and nominal GDP in 1960s and 1970 helped win over many economists to monetarism camp. Now look at the figure 32.13 M2 and nominal GDP in 1980 and 2009. It shows that same two variables M2 and nominal GDP from 1980s through 2009. The steady relationship between the two seems to have vanished. What happened? Figure 32.13 M2 and nominal GDP 1980 and 2009. The close relationship between M2 and nominal GDP a year later that had prevailed in the 1960s and 1970s seems to vanish from the 90s onward. Now let's proceed to the new classical school and response to policy. The new classical economics suggests the people should have responded to the fiscal and monetary policy of the 1980s in predictable ways. They did not, and they has created a new doubts among economics about validity of the new classical agreement. The rational expectation hypothesis predicts that its safe monetary policy by the Fed is anticipated. It will have no effect on real GDP and showing in the rate of growth of money supply over period in 1979 and 1982. Was surely well known, the Fed announced at the outset what is going to do, and then did it. It had full support first of President Carter and then President Reagan. But the policy plunged the economic into what has its worst recessions since the Great Depressions. The experience hardly seems inconsistent with the new classical logic. The new classical economics argue that people have doubt the Fed would keep its word, but the episode still casts doubt on the rational expectation agreement. The event of the 1980s do not suggest that either monetarism or new classical ideas would be bounded, but those events certainly raised doubt about railing solely of these approaches. Doubt about Keynesian event of the 1970s led Keynesian to modify, strengthen their approach. Perhaps the event of the 1980s and 1990s will produce similar progress within the monetarism and new classical camps. So the public response to the huge defense of Reagan era also seems to believe in new ideas classical. One new classical agreement predicts that people will increase their saving rate in response to increase in public sector borrowing. The resultant reduction of consumption will cancel the impact of the increase of deficit finance government in trajectory, but the private saving in the United States fell during 1980s. The new physical economics content the standards of classical agreement. Now let's proceed to a macroeconomic consensus. So what macroeconomic consensus? Consensus in macroeconomic policies issued, then are some other economic issues. Surveys of economics in general show the new Keynesian approach and emerge as the prevalent approach to macroeconomic analysis. The finding about 80% of economists agree the exploratory fiscal measure can deal with recessionary gaps certainly suggests, and the most economists can be counted in the new Keynesian camp. Neither monetarism nor new classical ideas would support such a measure, and the other time there considerable discomfort about actual using discretionary fiscal policy, as the new surveys show that 70% economics feel the discretionary fiscal policy should be avoided and the business cycle. Just as the new Keynesian approach appear to have won support among most economists, it has become dominant in terms of macroeconomic policy. So did the experience of the 2007 and 2009 recession affect the views of economics operating macroeconomic policy? One source of arguing possible change in opinion economics in National Association for Business Economics twice yearly survey of economic policy. According to August 2010 surveys, 242 members of NABE, most 60% were supportive of monetary policy at that time, which was exploratory and continued to be at least through 2010. Concerning fiscal policy, there was less agreement. Still, according to the survey taken at the time, the 2009 fiscal stimulation was being debated. 22% characterized it as about right, another third found in restrictive, and only 1/3 found in the simulation. In the August 2010 survey, 39% thought fiscal policy about right, 24% found it too restrictive, and 37% found it too stimulative. Also, near 75 ranked promotion of economic growth more important than defection reductions. Through 2/3 supported an extension of unemployment benefits, and 60% agreed that federal assistance funds to states from 2009 stimulation package was appropriate. Taken together, and the new Keynesian approach still seems to reflect the dominant. So that's about macroeconomic consensus. That would be all, and thank you.